Well, welcome to this session on the age of revolution and romanticism. I hope you'll enjoy this. I think it's a very exciting time, a very exciting period in Western civilization, and one that is becoming more and more familiar to us all the time as we get closer to our own age. So let's get started. The age of revolution and romanticism is roughly 1775 until 1850. Why is it called the age of revolution and romanticism? Well, because it's revolutionary. There were revolutions during this time. The anti-aristocratic restructuring of society happened to establish equality and representative government. Not all the revolutions were successful. Not all the revolutions ended up establishing equal government and equality among citizens, but it was a movement that was aimed in that direction. And we call it romantic because the Romantics stressed human feelings rather than on reason alone. Remember in the Age of Enlightenment that it was all about reason. It was all about the mind. Well, they tried that for about 3/4 of a century and decided that maybe human beings are more than just brains, more than just minds. So they switched, and the emphasis now became on feelings and passions and mysterious experiences and the macabre even. And so that's the emphasis. And they tried that to see if that might bring the kind of fulfillment and betterment of society that they were aiming for. The Revolutionary and Romantic Period obviously came about because there were some changes during the period of Enlightenment, which was from 1700 to 1775. Remember, the modern rationalist philosophies arose, René Descartes and John Locke. René Descartes is the father of modern rationalist philosophies. And then, of course, John Locke is the father or the originator of what we would think of as empirical science. There was also the abuse of power by the aristocracy in the previous period. Remember Louis XIV and the Baroque and the continuing insistence that the aristocracy should rule society and that the common people should have very little say in that. Obviously, the common people, the middle class and lower, didn't agree with that. And so this is the period where the revolutions and the upheavals took place to correct that. Also, there was increasing literacy among people. More and more people could read, and that meant that they had exposure to ideas and philosophies that would give feet to their urges for equality and for a social change. What form might that take? I mean, let's say we overthrow the king. Do we keep the king? Only limit his powers? Do we set up a republic? Do we set up a democracy? Do we set up some sort of oligarchy where certain people are, they rule and, they sort of replace the aristocracy? Or is there some other form of government? So let's talk about the first of the successful revolutions, and that would be our own, the American Revolution. We are an interesting people, we Americans. We are composed of a lot of different ethnicities and backgrounds and so forth. And even at this period in the 1700s, there was a lot of diversity among the settlers in the British colonies in North America. During that time, at least in the beginning, the British government, we call it the Crown had a hands-off policy. They basically granted charters for people to go start colonies in the New World, and if you were successful, wonderful. If you weren't, well, that's too bad. But the Crown was not going to finance anything, or it wasn't going to finance very much. Either you sank or swim on your own. Well, as the colonies became established and more successful, then suddenly there's money being generated, there's success being achieved in these colonies, and the Crown becomes more interested, and now they're sending colonial governors, they're imposing taxes, wanting to make laws. And by this time, especially in the, all throughout the late 1600s and into the early 1700s, the Americans had gotten fairly used to running their own affairs. I mean, they considered themselves loyal British subjects, and they did call upon the mother country to do a few things, especially when there was war with France and to help them with the Native American raids and so forth. But for the most part, Americans ran their own affairs on a local level. And so this was because there was so much distance between the North American colonies and Britain. It would take at a minimum of 3 weeks to sail from Britain to North America, and then, of course, 3 weeks back. If the winds and the tides were not favorable, it could take up to 3 months. So that's a long time. There was definitely a different American culture developed. Americans just made do on the frontier. They developed their own ways of doing things, thinking, speaking. The accents had become different because different groups of people had melded into the population, and that changes the way people speak. There were also new political ideas inspired by various writings, especially Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he said we don't need a monarchy. We can run our own lives. And Thomas Paine, by the time of the Revolution, had emigrated from Britain to the American colonies, and so he'd become an American himself. There was also a lot of new blood. Besides the original English settlers along the coast, there were Dutch. The Dutch had been there for a long time, almost as long as the English settlers had. The Dutch, remember, had founded a colony that we now would call New York City, but in those days it was called New Amsterdam. Some of my family were among those settlers. Bogart is a Dutch name, and we go back to the New Amsterdam settlement in the 1600s, the mid-1600s. There were Germans that settled in Pennsylvania and other places. There were the Scots-Irish that had settled along the frontier. They were not well liked by the English, so they were invited to move on west, and they became really the foundation of the Appalachian population. We might call them hillbillies, or basically they're the mountain people on the East Coast, a lot of them. There were Native Americans that melded into the population, married in. There were African slaves, of course, and they added their flavor, and many, many others. These are the 13 American colonies that did break away from Great Britain. But they weren't the only British colonies in North America. There was Nova Scotia. There was the province of Quebec. There were islands in the Caribbean that belonged to the British. None of them rebelled. It was just those colonies from New Hampshire to Georgia that decided to rebel. There were also some injustices that were suffered. And whether they were real or perceived is not the issue. The Americans believed that they had been treated unjustly and disrespectfully. We'll talk about what some of those things were in just a moment. But most of it was that they felt disregarded, and more or less that they were not even real British citizens, that they were simply just dumb colonials who were out of the mainstream of what was going on in the world. As I said, more than 150 years of colonial history had shown that the Crown policy towards the colonies was very inconsistent. It began with neglect. Hey, you're on your own. Don't look to us for support. And then when the colonies became more successful, then the Crown wanted the piece of the action. And that's how the Americans felt about it. The king in 1775 and 1776 was George III. He believed in the absolute right of monarchs, absolute monarchies, and he considered the colonies as resources for his growing empire. Of course, they're resources. I use their timber. We use their cotton. We use some of their natural resources, and we export our manufactured goods to them. And with Parliament, there was an increasing intervention into colonial affairs through laws and taxes. Several types of taxes and parliamentary actions were imposed by the Crown, and Americans got upset about them, even rather violently upset about them, and each time the act would be repealed. For example, the Stamp Act. We think of stamps as something you put on letters, but the Stamp Act really was any kind of official paper document needed to have an official government stamp on it. So even a wedding license, you couldn't have a wedding license unless you paid the stamp tax, or stationery for writing letters, any kind of legal document. Anything that was written and official needed to have a stamp tax put on it. And Americans thought that was unjust, so Parliament repealed it. There was the Sugar Act, which was a tax on sugar. Americans reacted, Parliament repealed it. There was the Quartering Act. This one was especially angering to Americans because the British sent troops over to fight the Native Americans and to fight the French during the French and Indian War. And then they decided that they'd keep some troops in North America, which made the Americans angry. Why are there troops here? Do you consider us to be a threat? Are you going to clamp down on us and use these troops to keep us under your thumb? And the Parliament said that the colonies had to pay for the quartering of these troops, either in building barracks for them or buying unused houses and properties to quarter these troops, in other words, to house these troops, or in some way to do that. And sometimes even homes were commandeered to house British troops, which the owners of those homes and the residents of those homes didn't appreciate. Well, that was also repealed. The Townshend Acts were much more of an in-your-face kind of a thing by Parliament. The Townshend Acts were all about saying, we have the right to pass laws for the colonies, and you don't have the right to deny us the ability to do that. We can tax you if we want to tax you. We can make laws to impose upon you if we want to. The Townshend Acts were basically done to prove that Parliament had the power and that the colonies should just shut up about it. That was really the red flag. I know the tax on tea was what sent them over the edge, but really I think it started with the Townshend Acts, in which Americans basically were told, you don't have a voice and don't expect us to give you one. And finally, the Tea Act was a move by Parliament to actually bail out the British East India Company, who had warehouses stocked with Indian tea that they couldn't sell. And so what they decided to do was to lower the price on this Indian tea, make it very cheap, import it into the American colonies, but then tax it so that they'd get their money. And the Americans said, wait a second, we didn't ask the East India Company to warehouse so much tea. You're dumping it on us. Yes, it's cheap, but you're also imposing a tax that we had no say in making. We didn't get to vote on that tax. And so that resulted in the Boston Tea Party, in which they boarded a ship that was in Boston Harbor, loaded with tea, and they unloaded the tea into the harbor. So here are three figures that were very instrumental in starting the revolution. There was John Adams on the left. He was a man of basically reasoned temperament. He wanted to be just and right about what they did. He was a lawyer from Boston. He even defended the troops who were involved in the shooting of civilians in the Boston Massacre. His cousin Samuel Adams, he was an outspoken man, very, very aggressive in his speech, and he was not a reasoned man at all. And he was guilty of stirring up all sorts of insurrection and bad feelings against the British government. And then there you see Patrick Henry, who was a Virginian, and he also was the one who said, as for me, give me liberty or give me death. So with the ups and downs of the British Parliament imposing taxes and laws upon the American colonists without their having any say in the matter, with people like John Adams and especially Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry very strongly voicing disapproval and urging people not to participate, then things came to a head in 1775, in which the colonists, as I mentioned, there was a tea ship that sailed into Boston Harbor. The Americans said, don't bother to dock. We're not going to accept your tea. This is something that you're imposing upon us. The ship docked anyway. The British government said, you will unload this ship or there will be people arrested. And so the colonists, dressed up as Native Americans, boarded the ship and unloaded the tea just as they were told to do, except they didn't unload it on the docks. They unloaded it into the harbor and ruined the cargo. And we're talking about probably the equivalent of, maybe $1 million worth of cargo that was spoiled, equivalent in the currency of that day. It was basically an act of war. The colonists said, we're finished, we're done, we're not talking anymore, we're not going to take this anymore. And so what happened? The British increased their garrison in Boston Harbor. They sent more troops. The troops began to patrol the city. They were looking for the people who had done this. There was a group called the Sons of Liberty that people were pretty sure had done it, and of course they probably did. And they were wanted men, so things were kind of getting out of control. And the colonial governor, instead of trying to make peace, which I think at this point still was possible, really cracked down hard on the American colonies. So the British increased their troop levels. The Americans then reacted by convening a Continental Congress in Philadelphia, which was more centrally located to all the colonies, to discuss their issues and options. They had not declared independence yet, but they felt that they needed to get together, all 13 colonies, and decide, what do we do from here? It's coming to the place where it's getting out of control. So the Americans also, as the troops were increased, Americans retaliated by raising militia, drilling, and stockpiling arms. All the colonies did this, but especially Massachusetts, because the British thought that Massachusetts was the hotbed of revolution, and it was. So most of the troops were sent to Boston, and people in Massachusetts were raising new militia units, but all the colonies were involved, because all the colonies thought, if they're going to do this to Massachusetts, they surely wouldn't stop if they felt the need that they should do it to us as well. The British commander got word that there were arms stockpiled in Concord, Massachusetts, which was a few miles inland from Boston. So he sent a column of troops to confiscate the stockpiled munitions, and they encountered the first militia group to oppose them at Lexington, which is about halfway between Boston and Concord. And at Lexington, the British column marched up. There was a group of American militiamen blocking the road. The British commandant of the column said, "Disperse, you damned rebels." And some farmer with a trigger-happy finger basically fired the first shot, and the British just mowed them down. It was a terrible bloodbath. There were numbers of men down. The women had been watching. They were looking at the confrontation, and to their horror, their sons, their husbands, their brothers, their fathers were shot down. The British marched over them and on the way to Concord, and it was on. But as they marched, church bells were ringing, calling militias to form up, and by the time they got to Concord, they met a much different militia group. This group was dug in, they were more disciplined, and they gave the British quite a bloody nose. The British did confiscate the munitions and arms. They got what they came for, but they had been in a fairly serious battle. But the battle wasn't over yet. As they marched back to Boston with these confiscated weapons and ammunition, the Americans decided, we're not going to face them. We don't know how to do that. But they fought them what we call Indian style. They fought them from behind rocks and trees. They set ambushes at bridges and at crossroads. And by the time the British column got back to Boston, they were greatly reduced in numbers. In fact, the unit had to be dissolved. There just wasn't enough left of that unit to be effective. So they dispersed the soldiers into other regiments and so forth. It was a real bloodbath. Obviously, the British are not going to take that lying down. So the Congress in Philadelphia debated about this. It went on for quite a while. This happened in 1775. It wasn't until July of 1776 that the Congress finally realized that there was no turning back. They couldn't conciliate King George. They had sent several letters to King George saying, please, let's talk about this. We don't hate being part of Britain. We just want to be treated fairly. King George basically told them that they had no voice, that they shouldn't expect that, and that, they basically didn't count. And so as the war went on and the fighting continued, the British clamped down. The Continentals basically surrounded Boston with cannon that they had captured from a British fort at Ticonderoga. And the British had to withdraw, but it was now no turning back. And so finally the members of Congress decided that they had no alternative but to declare their independence. In effect, they had done that already with the battles of Lexington and Concord. So July 4th, they formally declared independence. That's our Independence Day. 1775 to 1783, so that's quite a long time, 8 years or so the war lasted. Most of the time the British won the battles because the Americans did not have the training, they did not have the personnel, they did not have the leadership, they did not have the ammunition or the arms or the skill or anything. But we were fighting on our own soil, we were fighting for our own independence, And the British more and more saw the war as basically a waste of money. The British public was very much discouraged about this. The Parliament was divided about whether the war should continue even. And so basically we won by just simply holding on. Also with the aid of France and several other European countries gave us some leadership, gave us some training. Our training came from Germany, so the American Army was initially trained in the German style. But we had some French who were contributing as well, and we received arms from France, and eventually we received military aid, including troops from France. After several key victories, the Americans eventually won our independence, using the tactic of wearing down British forces and creating a climate of discouragement in the British public. So that led to the formation of the United States of America. Eventually, there was a constitution written. It took several years for that to happen. There were some beginning documents called the Articles of Confederation, but those weren't really sufficient, and so a stronger document called the U.S. Constitution set up a multi-level representative form of government. It was the form of a republic. There was the federal government and the state governments. Initially, the state governments were much stronger than the federal government. The federal government was only considered to be necessary insofar as there were matters that transcended, one particular state's jurisdiction and affairs. But now, of course, the federal government is far more powerful than any state government. And of course, we came up with the idea that government should be balanced with separation of powers between the executive, that would be the president, or a governor on the state level, the legislative, that would be U.S. Congress, or it would be a state assembly, and the judicial system, different levels of judges and courts. All right, let's switch gears and talk about the French Revolution. The French had been watching very closely at what was happening in the British colonies in North America. They were ancestral enemies of the English. They didn't want to get involved at first because they didn't want to back a losing candidate. They didn't want to back the revolution if the Americans had no chance. But once we won a few battles, and I think it was the Battle of Saratoga that really convinced the French that we could actually win. And so the French decided that they would do more than just send us weapons and advisors. They began to send some troops. And so they declared war on England. And their king was Louis XVI by this time. He was a very absolute monarch. His queen was an Austrian princess, Marie Antoinette. And they were very much disregarding the people of France. They felt that they had the divine right to rule, that nobody should be able to challenge their wishes. But they liked what they saw in North America, not because they liked revolution. They were afraid that the revolution might spread to France, but they did hate England and they wanted a chance to get back at England. So here was a chance to back the Americans, to declare war on England, and eventually, since the American Revolution was successful, France was victorious from their perspective also. The poor and the middle class of France also felt oppressed by the nobility, and they lacked hope for change. And so while the French nobility was glad that they had beat Britain, the middle classes and the poor in France were glad that the revolution against the British monarchy was successful because it proved that it could be done and that they could maybe do it too. In 1789, there was a group of middle-class merchants and wealthy people who met with some poor folks. The Catholic Church was involved, and they saw that revolution was coming in France. And so they took this oath on this tennis court, called the Oath of the Tennis Court, in which they pledged to work for real change so that there would not be a bloody revolution in France. Well, problem is, it was too little too late, because later that year, there was an incident that sparked a riot in which the mob stormed the Bastille, which was the political prison in France. They freed the prisoners, and the French Revolution was on, and it was a bloodbath. I mean, ours was a Sunday school picnic compared to theirs. Theirs was a horrible neighbor turning against neighbor, people turning each other in. When maybe there was nothing that the person had done, they just were settling a grudge. They turned them into the authorities. The people were executed for crimes that couldn't be proved. all kinds of things. So from 1789 to 1793, there was a bloodbath of executions among those who were associated with l'Ancien Régime, the old order of things. So a lot of the aristocracy, if they didn't flee, they were arrested, they were tried, and many of them were executed. Also, anybody who had supported Louis XVI, and they used this famous new execution tool called the guillotine. The government that replaced the royal government was the Committee for Public Safety under Robespierre. However, it was worse than the royal government. It was not that it didn't care about the people, it's just that it didn't know how to run a country. So lots of things broke down. They tried all kinds of outlandish experiments with society that didn't work. And so eventually Robespierre himself went to the guillotine, and the Committee for Public Safety just wasn't able to govern as they promised that they would. So the French Revolution descended into chaos. It was everybody for themselves. When a young and very ambitious general, he was, I think, in his late 20s when he was promoted to general. He had been very successful against some of France's enemies, and his name was Napoleon Bonaparte. So seeing that something had to be done, Napoleon seized power in 1799. And for 16 years, he built a French republic and a French empire. He was fighting practically everybody in Europe at one time or another. He fought the British, he fought the Spanish, he fought the Prussians, he fought the Austrians, he fought the Portuguese, he fought Russia, and some of the Italian armies. And then it seems like the only ally he really had was the United States, because we felt we owed France. We still remembered that France helped us in our revolution. So we were Napoleon's allies. We didn't help them very much, but we certainly sent them aid and we traded with them. Here's a map of the French Empire at the height of Napoleon's power. You can see that France itself is in the sort of bluish-green color. Napoleon's additions to France by 1812 included, Belgium and the Netherlands, and parts of northern Germany, parts of Italy were part of that. And then states under Napoleon's control in the pink would be quite a bit of Germany, quite a bit of Italy, quite a bit of Spain, and even parts of what now would be Poland. And then the Napoleon's allies would be Austria and Prussia and Norway at the time. And then, of course, England and Portugal are the ones standing out against Napoleon. And then eventually they're able to flip some of these other allies of Napoleon and cause his defeat. Napoleon reformed the French military, made it into a formidable fighting machine, whereas before it had been rather inept under the revolutionary government. He reformed French law, which is still very much the basis of French law today, reformed the French government, and for a limited time, he brought power and prosperity to France. However, in the later years, France was under pressure as more and more allies of France were flipped by Britain, and increasingly France was besieged. They continued to win battles until the very end, when they began to lose battles. The armies were running out, Napoleon's armies were running out, and the British began to really gain some foothold against Napoleon. And a lot of it was due to the British Navy. The British Navy really dominated the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon was never able to field the navy that could challenge Britain in a very large way. And so eventually Napoleon's empire began to crumble. He invaded Russia in 1812. The Russians were able to drive the French out. That was kind of the beginning of the end. And then, of course, he was defeated in 1814. He was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. He eventually escaped Elba, went back to France, raised another French army, and tried to revive his empire, and was finally crushed by a coalition of British, Dutch, and Prussian forces, Prussian meaning North Germany, at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium in 1815. At this time, Napoleon was captured, and this time not exiled to an island in the Mediterranean. He was exiled to an island in the South Atlantic where he died a few years later. And that was the end. Well, since the United States had been successful in its revolution, and France had had a successful revolution, although very bloody and very dark, other regions that were colonial possessions of various countries also had revolutions. The next one was in Haiti, of all places. Haiti revolted from France, from Napoleon's France in 1804. Actually, Napoleon was kind of glad to be rid of Haiti. It was continually a source of problems. He had already sold the Louisiana Purchase to the United States a year or so before that, and he decided to just get out of the business in America, and he gave up on Haiti in 1804. Haiti got its independence. South America, the different countries separated from Spain in the years 1810 to 1825. So countries like Colombia and Venezuela and other countries like that got their independence from Spain. Central America also got its independence from Spain in 1821. Originally, it was kind of a single country from Panama to Guatemala, but the different regions couldn't quite get along, and there was a power struggle of different leaders, and so the country split up into the countries that you see today in Central America. Mexico got its independence from Spain also in 1821. It began with El Grito de Dolores on September 15th. I believe it was 1810, under the priest Miguel Hidalgo. And they fought a long war to get their independence and finally were able to be independent in 1821 and became a separate sovereign nation away from Spain. And by the way, Mexican independence is not May 5th. It's not Cinco de Mayo. Cinco de Mayo is a victory of Mexico over the French in the 1860s or 70s. There was a decisive battle in Puebla, but it wasn't Mexican independence. It was just a victory over the French who had invaded Mexico and tried to establish Mexico as a French possession or a French satellite. The real Mexican Independence Day is 16 de septiembre, the day that the Grito de Dolores was made public. So Mexican Independence, September 16th. Let's talk about the artistic and literary and musical forms that took place during this very tumultuous time. Romanticism is a reaction to the cold self-discipline of logic and reason that had dominated the previous decades during the time of the Enlightenment. There was a stress in literature and the arts on feeling and passion and beauty and the nobility of humanity and the grandeur of nature, as well as the macabre, which we talked about earlier in this session. Macabre is a sort of a fixation on the grotesque or on the deformed or on the twisted. And that becomes something that increasingly, as passion is explored, the macabre begins to become featured more and more. Music developed during the Romantic period. Some of the great composers during this period, Ludwig van Beethoven wrote his famous Pastoral, and also he wrote a great musical piece called the Eroica, which was dedicated to his hero, Napoleon Bonaparte. Beethoven himself was kind of a tragic figure. He fits right into the Romantic period. He was a composer who, over the years, continually and steadily lost his hearing. Able to compose great music, he heard it in his head, but by the end of his career, he couldn't hear the orchestra play. There's a story about Beethoven having conducted one of his great symphonies and was still facing the orchestra at the end, and the crowd rose with great applause. When they were standing, they were giving a standing ovation, and one of the musicians had to step up to where Beethoven was standing and physically turn him around to face the audience to actually see the applause. He couldn't hear it. And he was a very, very sad man. He had once been very personable. He was good at parties and so forth, but by the end of his life, he was kind of a bitter recluse because he lost his hearing. And he's a key transition in music from the classical period of the Enlightenment to the Romantic period. Franz Schubert was an Austrian composer of symphonies. You may have heard of Schubert's symphonies. And Friedrich Chopin was a Polish piano virtuoso, again, a tragic figure, and really fit very well into the whole Romantic period. Moving on to European Romantic literature, there was Goethe. Goethe was a German writer, maybe one of the greatest writers in German literature. They say that there are three great works of German literature that people go back to over and over again. One would be Luther's translation of the Bible into German. That would be one of the great works in German literature. Another would be Goethe's works, Dr. Faust. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then also the works of Adolf Hitler. Not that Hitler was a great man or that what he had to say was great, but that he was a tremendous wordsmith, that he had tremendous persuasive power in the German language. Some of the most powerful German is in those speeches. I'm no authority on German, but that is what I have been told. Goethe wrote Dr. Faust, which would be an exploration of personal desire and where it leads. The story about Faust is that Faust made a deal with the devil, that if the devil would give him the ability to satisfy his passions completely, that the devil could have his soul. And Goethe does with Faust what you would expect, and that is that Faust pursues his passions and makes a mess of his life, makes a mess of other people's lives, destroys pretty much everything around him, and then the devil comes for his soul at the end, and Faust says, well, you can't have it because I was never really satisfied. I thought my passions would give me satisfaction, but they only led to misery. And that's the whole moral of the story. In England, George Gordon was Lord Byron. He was a British poet. He was a traveler, and he was a sensualist. They said he had a woman pretty much wherever he traveled. I think he saw himself as a fairly handsome person, and apparently women thought so too. And he got caught up in a revolution, and was on the wrong side and was killed. We'll see that he features into another author a little bit later. Also in English literature, William Wordsworth was a great poet, and he explored passion. He explored the whole grandeur of nature and appreciating nature. The sisters Charlotte and Emily Bronte wrote novels about English life and about tragic romance. Wuthering Heights is probably the best example. And then Mary Shelley is the one that was caught up with Lord Byron, George Gordon, who was called Lord Byron. She was married, but seems to have had an affair with Lord Byron. And of course, she's the authoress of Frankenstein. It's interesting, Frankenstein is all about what happens when you turn your brain off. It's all about what happens when science is not guided by reason. When science is just allowed to go crazy with its experimentation and the whole pursuit of desire to achieve. And what does it produce? Well, it produced the monster Frankenstein, according to Shelley. Edgar Allan Poe is one of the great early American writers. He was a newspaper editor, kind of failed over and over again in the newspaper business. Edgar Allan Poe was also, from what I understand, he was the beginner of the detective genre in novels about detectives solving crimes, which later authors would pick up on. And he wrote many tragic poems and stories like The Cask of Amontillado, the Telltale Heart, the poem The Raven, so many of those things. And he, of course, was a native of Baltimore, and that's why the sports team is called the Baltimore Ravens, after his poem. He also died young. He was apparently a drug addict and an alcoholic, and was found basically beside the road one day at a fairly young age. American transcendentalist writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau's a very interesting person. He believed that you ought to just be able to appreciate nature, that you shouldn't have any distractions in life, and so he set about on a 2-year quest to do nothing but to experience nature. So he had a cabin on Walden Pond in Massachusetts, where he did nothing every day but get up and just observe nature, observe the birds. In the wintertime, he would watch the frost form on the pond, which back east they call what we would call lakes. In the West, they would, a small lake would be called a pond. And he basically did that for months and months. He wrote long passages about watching the ducks land on the pond and all of that. And he was very interested in just pursuing the experience of being alive. That's why they're called transcendentalists, because they wanted to experience things. They're both called also existentialists, meaning I just want to exist, I just want to be. Moving on to romantic art, we have Caspar David Friedrich, German painter of allegorical landscapes. You can see in this picture a perfect example of romantic painting. He's painting a ruined abbey, which would be a monastery, in a shriveled up, gnarled up, dead forest of oak trees, and it's supposed to evoke passion. It's supposed to evoke feeling. It's supposed to make you feel something. Sadness, creepiness, spookiness, something. And it's the perfect example of romantic art trying to make you feel something. One of the great painters of this period was an American painter, George Catlin. He doesn't get studied very much. But Catlin felt that with the advance of American civilization to the west, a lot of the Native American tribes were being wiped out or driven further west or put on reservations or maybe assimilated into American culture. And he thought we need to have some record of them while they still exist. And so he went throughout the American West painting some of the great chiefs and leaders of the Native American tribes. This is a great example of that. It would be White Cloud, head chief of the Iowa. And of course, we named a whole state after this tribe. It's the state of Iowa. Albert Bierstadt was born of German parents who had immigrated to the United States. So he's an American-born painter. And he painted great landscapes in the West. In fact, he was out here in California, just after California became a state, painting great landscapes in the Sierra Nevada, which many of us have traveled to. We've seen sunrises or sunsets or great panoramas of the Sierra Nevada. And again, that's supposed to make you feel something, feel a oneness with nature, feel the grandeur of nature. Goya was a Spanish painter who liked to emphasize the darkness of the human imagination, the dark side of human imagination. And I think that Colossus is all about, how the civilization has gotten so big that it dominates people's lives, and that people, in the name of civilization, have done some terrible things. This is called the Colossus. Goya also painted scenes from the French invasion of Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, and there's a particular painting that's in the textbook that shows Spanish guerrilla fighters being shot, executed by French soldiers. There's another drawing of Goya's that's in the textbook in which a person has gone to sleep, maybe a scientist or some thinker has gone to sleep with his head on the table, and the caption that Goya wrote was El sueño de la razón produce monstruos, meaning that when you put your reason to sleep, when your mind goes to sleep, when you turn off your rationality, your intellect, and just dream and just let your passions run wild, what does it produce? Monsters. And we're going to end with this painting by Ingress. Ingress, I think, shows where Romanticism eventually led. It led to the excess of passion, the excess of emotion, the excess of just gratification of all of our senses. What would be a better example of that than a Turkish harem in which you just have dozens and dozens of women there just to satisfy passion, and it's too much of something. And this is what happened at the end of the Romantic period, that many of the thinkers are saying, wait a minute, we've turned off our intellects. It can produce bad things when you do that. Even allowing our passions to fulfill themselves, almost like, glutting ourselves on food, it doesn't produce the satisfaction that we were looking for. It's too much. So therefore, the period began to change. Thinking and the trends began to change away from emotion, away from passion, and into something else that we call industrial materialism, where there's an emphasis on the producing of goods and services, just producing of more things. So you see that the Enlightenment was all about let's pursue rationality, and that didn't achieve what was desired. Okay, now let's pursue passion, and that did not achieve what's desired. So now in industrial materialism, they're going to pursue the production of goods and services to see if that satisfies what we want. And we'll see that even that does not. But we'll look at that in the next session.